This is a recap of the first lecture of the first semester on the Marxification of the Western ethos. This 4-semester course is being taught and given by the current speaker Ondrushka at the Institute CHT and in this year of grace, 2023. The first lecture is entitled The Speculative Gnosticism of the Marxist Faith. Introduction. I think it is important to begin with a slight recap of the last event before I really begin. Last Sunday, I attempted to give everybody a very low-resolution narrative of a very complicated overarching phenomenon, and this accounts for the scattering and jumping around. What I'm trying to map out is the Western, and American for that matter, ethos, what it is and how it came to be. Our story technically begins with Rousseau and Hegel, but matters more specifically when beginning with Marx, which is why the first lecture of this series concerns some of his philosophy. In Sunday's lecture, I not only briefly made it clear that what was put forth by Marx failed in every way and everywhere for very obvious reasons that will be explained in upcoming lectures, but more importantly, that there was a revivalist force in the intelligentsia that saw these shortcomings very early on and ingeniously rebaggaged it all by shifting the domain of analysis to culture rather than the economic, that is, to identity rather than class. I explained this to be an ingenious move on their part, because with culture and matters of identity rather than the economic and matters of class, one does not have to face the sheer scrutiny of science or a correspondence theory of truth because, in fact, culture and identity are much more subjective, qualitative, malleable, and not fixed. This paradigm shift, this repackaging of Marxism, is called critical theory, which is simply known by common parlance as neo-Marxism. This is the world we all live in today. Why is the American ethos Marxified? This is why, and it is not a right-wing conspiracy theory, as the radical left would have you think. If there is anything vital to understand before I move on, it would be to understand that critical theory is Marxism, only with the domain of analysis applied to culture rather than the economic, to identity rather than class. It is neo-Marxism, and it is quite literally nothing else. I begin this lecture with definitions, and must start with religion. In defining religion, one must consider the broader context of its usage and history, for the very reason that religion is, in fact, a modern concept, manifesting from the impinging contrast of the Western ease over ought climate. Prior to the Western ethic and its epistemological versus axiological atmosphere, religion was so inextricably linked with being. That is, to live was to be religious. It was the way of life. It was religere, or as Cicero put it, to go through again in reading and thought. There are various other etymologies, but all holding generally the same themes. Because religion predates the Western is over ought ethos, it is universal to all interpretations that religion does not concern knowledge or epistemology, but rather purpose or teleology. This is a universal in religion, regardless of interpretational variation. It is important that when defining the Marxist faith as in fact a faith, one must first accept the truth that nothing about how religion has been used across all of time suggests the necessity of some superhuman divine agency, or even the supernatural for that matter, but rather only the acting out, both in mind and body, as if such beliefs were presuppositionally true. When lightning struck or the earth shook, it was only presuppositional to assume some divine agency or inner power at work. Religion across all of time thus chiefly concerns this presuppositional acting out in the environment. Because of this fact, not all religions worship the superstitious or superhuman. Some may include Jainism, white supremacist creativity, Taoism, Confucianism, Epicureanism, deism, pandeism, Scientology, paranormalogy, Nazi messianism, Unitarian Universalism, Jacobinism, etc. What is religion then, really? Well, it is indeed the case that scholars have failed to agree on specific terms, but despite this, they are nonetheless unanimous in their convictions that there are universal features that hold true about religion, regardless of and across all interpretational variations, and it is when these universals are met that religion is thus defined. These universals are threefold and together co-contingently define something religious. 1. Ontology. 2. Teleology. And 3. Axiology. A religion is any belief system that satisfies the tertiary criteria above, and for this reason, Marxism is a religion. Justice Ben Clemens has defined religion for the purpose of American Establishment Clause jurisprudence as a theory of man in the world that gives rise to duties of consciousness. This, again, reflects the anthropological literature which suggests the criteria is threefold, and that when this threefold criteria is met, religion broadly is thus defined: ontology, teleology, and axiology, that is, an ontology of man, or a theory of being in the world, a telos of history, or the purpose of phenomena and its trajectory, and finally, duties of conscience, or axiology. Religion are duties of conscience arising from an ontology-teleology synthesis. So, in defining religion, there must only be a worldview that synthesizes an ontology of man, that is, a theory of man in the world, with a teleology of history, that is, the purpose of phenomena and its material trajectory, which, when synthesized, thus giving rise to duties of conscience, that is, axiology. But what's most important is that the unfolding process of this triad is not contingent on the epistemological defaults of reason, deduction, inference, or correspondence. Thus, we have a belief, a value-laden system by design, aimed at a theory of the world and man's place in it. That's the ontology-teleology synthesis, which gives rise to duties of conscience, which is the axiology. This triad completely satisfies not only the etymological history of the word religion, but its meaning nearly across all of time. One may succinctly say in defining religion that the synthesis of ontology and teleology produces axiology. This definition of religion as a value-laden theory of man in the world that gives rise to duties of conscience holds univariately across all interpretational variations. It is important to characterize Marxism as a Gnostic, faith-based belief system, not just because it is a matter of truth, but because something religious cannot ever be sponsored collectively, state-sanctioned, for the reason that what would be imposed would always be someone else's belief system, as of course not all people hold identical worldviews. On the other hand, if what was being collectively sponsored held true on all dimensions of analysis, fact, what would be imposed would be applicable to the complete whole, regardless of beliefs or worldviews. Marxism is a special kind of worldview and doesn't belong in the schools nor sponsored collectively or governmentally. This is the liberal ethic. We must now define Gnosticism. The term Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnōsis, which means knowledge, but more importantly, awareness. Specifically an awareness of something not validated or achieved through the epistemological defaults of reason, inference, deduction, or correspondence. Special insight into the world is perhaps most accurate. According to the general Gnostic, this material world is not our home. We are trapped here in these bodies of flesh, and we need to learn how to escape through special insight. Emancipation from the world through special insight is the central theme of Marxism. Most scholars agree that there are fundamental hallmarks of Gnosticism. There is a basic criteria that makes something Gnostic, and when this criteria is satisfied, Gnosticism is thus defined, regardless of interpretational variation. This criteria is threefold, and the Marxist faith system satisfies this threefold unambiguously. Firstly, we have reception and revelation insight. This revelation or awakened consciousness, gnōsis, is central to the exegesis of the Marxist faith and is the first pillar of Gnosticism. When dressed up in economic disguise, as the preeminent Kolakowski once said, what you have is called class consciousness. It assumes that humankind is alien to himself, but possesses the ability to become complete through work. In other words, there is a need to assume the existence of some special insight out there in the ether which one can be awakened to through mystic speculation and self-creation. This completion at the end of history's unfolding is called Socialist Man. And what makes this process specifically Gnostic is that it is not arrived at through the epistemological defaults of logic, reason, inference, or correspondence, but rather what Marx called self-actualization, that is, class consciousness. Secondly, we have anti-cosmic world rejection, or the element of the speculative, speculum in the ecclesiastical tongue. This second fundamental pillar of Gnosticism requires you to reflect and ruthlessly criticize everything that is, and to assume that what is wrong with the order of being is in fact the world itself. What thus chiefly concerns Marx and his Gnosticism is his ontology of man and telos of history, that is, being in the world, Dasein, who we are as human beings and where we are going historically and spiritually. There is an aim to destroy the order of being, which is experienced as defective and unjust, and through man's creative power to replace it with a perfect and just order. Humanity's goal is to transcend this world through some esoteric gnōsis. This is supremely reflective of the Marxist faith. According to Marx, reality must be destroyed. This is the great concern of gnōsis. More importantly, though, one must produce the independence of his existence by speculation, and that it is through absolute dependence that he can be saved. This leads us to the last pinnacle of Gnosticism, that being the immanentization of the Eschaton, the need to produce heaven here on earth by achieving gnosis of one's incompleteness, which is fueled by a spiritual force of self-creation. This is achieved, according to Marx, by calling for the transformation of man at the fundamental level, eugenics. In Capital, he speaks of the importance of producing fully developed human beings, page 529, 30, or the full development of the human race, pages 554, 5. He speaks further on page 563 of man's necessity to develop himself. For Marx and the Gnostics, this process of unfolding and becoming complete is a spiritual process. Much like Gnosticism, the Marxist faith requires you to believe in a complete solution and aim of human suffering and existence. Marx follows the thought of Hegel, who understood labor as the act of man's self-creation. Labor, for Marx, is a spiritual activity, not a commodity. In summary, Gnostic movements are involved in the project of abolishing the constitution of being with its origin in the divine and replacing it with a world-immanent order of being, utopia, the perfection of which lies in the realm of human action, that is, self-creation/labor. This is literally the philosophy behind all Marxian discourse. So why is Marxism speculative Gnostic theology? Firstly, Marxian discourse believes that a change in the order of being lies in the realm of human action, self-creation, that is, labor, and that the world is that which needs to be changed, transcended, and subverted. Secondly, Marxian discourse believes in salvation from the world through special insight, gnosis, that isn't revealed by the epistemological defaults of logic, inference, deduction, or correspondence, but rather through what he called the awakened consciousness of man's incompleteness and self-creation, what in his deceptive economic language he calls class consciousness. And thirdly, Marxian discourse believes in an ultimate metaphysical solution to both human suffering and human purpose. Moving on, I would like to recap some rather grave misconceptions about the Marxian faith system. There are many terms used in Marxist literature that have been hijacked and thus do not mean what common English parlance suggests. These include ideology, science, labor, but some of particular importance here are history and materialism. History for Marx is not what is, but only that which is becoming. He did not mean history as what is meant by normal English definitions or that which pertains to written record. Marx saw history as an unfolding cosmic force with man at its center. He saw it as the unfolding of being in the process of becoming, and it was only this process, this trajectory, that constituted any meaning of history for Marx. History for Marx is the sum total of human phenomena in the unfolding process of becoming, and its end is the point at which he believed we must arrive. The end of history. For Marx, history in this sense not only makes man and all his faculties and cognitive schemata, but man reciprocally makes history. So remember that history for Marx isn't history in the sense of record or static facts. It's pseudo-scientific post-Hegelian mystic social alchemy fly feces. Marx made history and its projected telos, that is its purpose, inseparable from the activity of material phenomena, which he fetishizes as a magical linear metamorphosis process of becoming. That is, the purpose, whatever that may be, of history and its material phenomena are one of the same thing. They are simultaneous to each other and co-eternal. This is not the materialism that has been espoused for well over 2,000 years. This is a voodoo crackpot offshoot. Marx wasn't a materialist. In his economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, Marx proclaimed, "I deny the abstract materialism of natural science because it excludes history and its process and postulates naturalism and humanism." Marx was a religious nutboy, and everything he preached was wholesale and full-fledged metaphysics merely dressed up in economic disguise. Dialectical materialism, unlike all of traditional materialist thought, makes cosmic moral imperatives not only part of the process, but the process. Dialectical materialism is post-Hegelian crackpot cotton candy social alchemy BS, mixed up with some Feuerbachian physiognomic anti-naturalism. To put it more broadly, and again, it is a system where the trajectory of human material phenomena and its assigned theory of purpose becomes consolidated into a co-eternal celestial metamorphosis of becoming. And I say celestial because that's what Engels takes the pains to argue in his 1883 religious tract, Dialectics of Nature. Bertrand Russell sums this all up very succinctly when he says, "His belief that there is a cosmic force called dialectical materialism which governs human history independently of human volitions is mere mythology." The Lord Russell further expounds, "His purview is confined to this planet, and within this planet to man. It has been evident that man has not the cosmic importance which he formerly arrogated to himself. No man who has failed to assimilate this fact has a right to call his philosophy scientific." Marx professed himself an atheist, but retained a cosmic optimism which only theism could justify. The point to take away here is that man creates history, but that history in turn reciprocally creates man. This is history and materialism for Marx. This is historical materialism. The further point for Marx here is that this dialectical, bico-eternal, linear unfolding metamorphosis of man and history propagates through time unguided. Becoming conscious was the point here, achieving material class consciousness. Seizing the means of material production means not only becoming aware that this process has been unguided for all of time, this process of man and history and man, but that becoming conscious and aware means creating history itself. This leads me to another misconception, namely that the aim of Marx's work was fueled by the contempt of economic conditions. It was not material poverty that Marx saw as the basic tragedy of the workers under capitalism, but their stunted development in self-realization. Marx did not care for the poor. He did not. What concerned him chiefly was that capitalism divided and estranged one from becoming their complete sublated selves by masking the true causes of suffering which could only be realized and overcome through man's state of self-creation. Moving on here, if we were to tackle yet another misconception about Marx and his aspirations, it would have to be religion and his atheism. Marx was not an atheist. Marx believed in God and that God was man. He did not criticize religion for its epistemological approaches to reality, but rather because it hindered the process of humanity's awakened consciousness of self-creation, what Marx meant by labor. What Marx believed, from Feuerbach, was that nothing in the history of phenomena harnessed the human potential to such extremes as had the religious and transcendent. Religion is self-estranging and self-alienating by confining these extremes to the realm of the immaterial and ethereal rather than in man himself. The point here for Marx was that man needed to draw these extremes back into himself by first becoming conscious that he is incomplete. Believe it or not, I agree with Marx on the fact that in the religious and the transcendent we have poured our highest thoughts and purest feelings. On the other hand, what is to be done about this is where I differ. The great turning point of history for Marx will be when man becomes conscious that the only God of man is man himself, homo homini deus. The end of history will come when man has projected God back into himself as absolute man, as absolute creator in Hegelian lexicology. Marx's primary purpose in trying to abolish religion had nothing to do with its supposed truth value, which is a true atheist's agenda, but everything to do with its property to alienate and estrange man from becoming his absolute self, from becoming God. I end here with some conclusions and some final remarks. When people think of economics when they hear the name Marx, it actually means they have not ever read any Marx. We have learned that Marxism is not an economic theory, but a value-laden theory of man in the world. This is according to nearly all Marxist scholars, from Althusser to Habermas. It should not be too interesting that most readers would refer to Erich Voegelin as a source that irrevocably proves my point here, because the case Erich Voegelin makes for Marx's religiosity is striking and still has yet to be met with any substantial criticism. But I haven't mentioned him much because he wasn't a raging Marxist, nor did he live the philosophy. And as I have said, the best way to attack this comprehensive fatalistic philosophy is from the inside out. For this reason, I shall briefly mention three absolute giants in Marxian literature: Robert C. Tucker, Erich Fromm, and Leszek Kolakowski. Speaking of the numerous Marxist scholars, one is actually of particular interest, as he was explicitly instrumental in understanding and preserving the Marxist faith. Erich Fromm, his name, was, and he was, one of the leading experts in Marxist theory at that time. He was also a raging Marxist, and as I have told you, the best way to fight all this collectivist tribalism is to use their own material against them. Attack them on their own terms. It works every time. Anyways, Erich Fromm wrote a book called Marx's Concept of Man, and in this book nothing becomes more clear about what Marxism is. It's speculative Gnostic theology, or, as Fromm takes it, a new and radical step forward in the tradition of prophetic messianism. What's convincing about all this is that the entire book is based on the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, which, according to most Marxist scholars, is the most important writings of Marx in terms of depicting his philosophy and ideas. Fromm begins by telling us, and I quote, "It is one of the peculiar ironies of history that there are no limits to the misunderstanding and distortion of theories, even in an age when there is unlimited access to the sources. There is no more drastic example of this phenomenon than what has happened to the theory of Karl Marx in the last few decades." He then writes, "Marx's philosophy constitutes a spiritual existentialism in secular language. Marx's aim, socialism based on his theory of man, is essentially prophetic messianism in the language of the 19th century. It's important to understand that Marxism is religious dogma according to its own preeminent mouthpieces. In the first chapter of Fromm's analysis, called The Falsification of Marx's Concepts, he explicitly states that Marx's aim was that of the spiritual emancipation of man. In Chapter 2, Fromm reaffirms the fact that Marxism has very little to do with the economic, but rather something imbued with value-laden moral imperatives. He says, first of all, it must be noted that labour and capital were not at all for Marx only economic categories. They were anthropological categories, imbued with a value judgment which is rooted in his humanistic position. Much later in the book, Chapter 6, called Marx's Concept of Socialism, he suggests that Marx does not fit the term atheist by writing, "Marx's atheism is the most advanced form of rational mysticism, closer to Zen Buddhism than are most of those fighters for God and religion who accuse him of godlessness." This is one of the most decorated mouthpieces for Marx in the world at the time. Erich Fromm is not a trivial person in Marxist thinking, and was not only in fact instrumental in the development of neo-Marxism, but proves my point here entirely. Marxism is a religion. Now, on to Robert C. Tucker, Philosophy and Myth in Karl Marx, is a book written by perhaps one of the most eminent scholars of the Marxist faith in the 20th century, and of whom was, in fact, the very biographer of Stalin himself. He formulates the proposition that, and I quote, "the religious essence of Marx is superficially obscured by Marx's rejection of traditional religions." Resting the book on this general claim, he writes a section, Hegel to Marx, charting the linear process of Marxian philosophy from Hegel's theology. The first part of this section, Philosophical Revolts Against the World, is almost a perfect summation of Voegelin's The New Science of Politics. Both conclude that Feuerbach is actually Hegelian theology incarnate, but only with the primary locus inverted. Man is God, rather than God is man. The point for both scholars is that man is God. Tucker writes, "Thus, Hegel's self-alienated God becomes Feuerbach's self-alienated man, and history as the process of God's attaining to full self-consciousness through man turns into history as a process of man's attaining to full self-consciousness through God. Instead of man being conceived as the self of the Absolute, we have the Absolute represented as the self of man projected into objectivity. Instead of God being divided against himself in the Hegelian knowing situation, we have man divided against himself in the Feuerbachian religious situation. A conscious subject contemplates its externalized being as an object.